There is one sentence in the Bible that almost nobody reads twice. It sits at the very end of the flood story. The water is gone. The world is a graveyard. Noah steps off the boat onto the mud of a drowned planet, builds an altar, and burns an offering. And God smells the smoke. And God says something. He says he will never do it again. Never again destroy every living thing. Never again curse the ground because of human beings. And then he gives the reason. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. Never again, even though the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, even though. Stop on those two words, because they quietly detonate the entire story you were told. Because here is what the same book said before the flood, Genesis 6, verse 5. God looks at the world and sees that every inclination of the human heart is only evil, continually. That is the stated reason for the flood. That is the diagnosis. That is the justification for drowning a planet. Now read the sentence after the flood again. The same diagnosis. Word for word. The heart is still evil. From youth. Nothing changed. One honest note before we go further, because you will hear this objection in the comments, and it deserves an answer. The Hebrew word opening that phrase is kai. Some translations render it for. Some render it even though. Scholars have argued about which one is correct for a very long time, and they have not settled it. It doesn't matter. Pick either one. If it is for, then human evil is now the reason God will never flood the world again. The exact same fact that was the reason he did it. If it is even though, then God is promising restraint in spite of a condition the flood was supposed to remove. Either reading confesses the same thing. The reason for the flood survived the flood. Think about what that means. The largest punishment ever described in Scripture is reported, by the text itself, as having changed nothing. The disease was the reason for the treatment. The treatment killed almost every patient on earth, and the disease survived. If the flood was justice, it failed by its own stated standard. If it was a cure, it cured nothing. The flood story refutes the flood story, in its own last line. So that is what this video is about. 3 questions. What kind of God drowns a world for a condition the drowning does not change? Why does the oldest picture of divine justice fall apart the moment you read its final sentence? And if the anger was never really in the water, where was it? We are going to answer that third one with 2 things. A philosopher whose own community cursed him at the age of 23 for asking exactly this, and a broken clay tablet that sat in a box in London for 20 years because almost nobody alive could read what was written on it. Start with the philosopher. Amsterdam, the 27th of July, 1656. Inside the Portuguese synagogue, a document is read out loud to the congregation. It is called a sherem, an excommunication. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. The man it is aimed at is 23 years old. His name is Baruch Spinoza. His crime? He had not published a single word. There was no book, nothing to ban. They cursed him for talking, for what he had been saying, in private, to people who repeated it. The decree orders that nobody may speak with him. Nobody may write to him. Nobody may come within 4 cubits of him. Nobody may read anything he writes. A merchant's son. A brilliant student. 23 years old, and by most accounts not even in the building to hear it read. By some accounts, the community first tried money, a pension, on the condition that he keep showing up at synagogue and keep his mouth shut. He turned it down. Years later, a man came at him with a knife on the street. Spinoza kept the torn cloak for the rest of his life. He never had it repaired. And when he began sealing his letters, he had a ring made. It carried a rose, his initials, and one Latin word. Caut. Be careful. So what was so dangerous? This. Spinoza read the descriptions of God in Scripture, jealous, furious, grieving, regretting, changing his mind, walking, looking, and he noticed that every one of them described a very large human being. And he argued that this was not merely wrong, it was impossible. Here is his move. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. God, for Spinoza, is not a person, not a king, not a judge, not a magistrate with a temper. God is the whole of reality in its total and lawful order. He gave it a name that got him banned across Europe: Deus sive natura, God or nature. Two names for the same thing. And a lawful, infinite totality does not have moods. It does not want anything, because wanting means lacking something, and it lacks nothing. It cannot be offended, because it needs nothing from you. It cannot regret, because regret means discovering you were wrong, and discovering means you did not already know. Anger in a perfect being is a contradiction in terms. So where does the furious God of the flood come from? Spinoza's answer is the key to this entire video. He comes from us. In the theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, banned almost on arrival, he opens not with God, but with fear. People, he writes, are kept swinging between hope and dread, and anything that astonishes them, they take as a sign of the anger of the gods. And then, he says, they consider it impious not to buy that anger off with prayer and sacrifice. Read that again, because it is a complete description of the flood story, written 350 years ago about people who lived 4,000 years ago. Something overwhelming happens. Nobody knows why. So somebody decides it was aimed. Because an aimed disaster is terrible, but a random one is worse. An aimed disaster at least has a logic, and something you can do about it. The wrath was never in the water. The wrath was painted onto the water afterwards, by terrified people who needed the disaster to mean something. Now, that is a claim. So let's test it against the text. Read the flood story again, and watch how its God actually behaves. Before the flood, Genesis 6. God sees how great the wickedness has become, and it grieves him to his heart. The Hebrew is blunt. He was sorry that he had made human beings. Sorry. An all-knowing being, surprised by an outcome. A perfect craftsman, regretting his own work. That is not omniscience. That is a disappointed father, a frustrated inventor, a man whose project got away from him. And it is not one slip. A few chapters later, at Babel, human beings start building a tower. And what does God do? He comes down to see the city and the tower. Comes down to see, as if from somewhere else, as if he needed a closer look. This is a God with a location, a God who travels, a God who inspects. Spinoza noticed this, and what is striking is how bored he sounds about it. In the treatise, he simply lists it. The sacred books, he writes, speak very inaccurately of God, attributing to him hands, feet, eyes, ears, a mind, and motion from one place to another, and emotions, like jealousy and mercy. Motion from one place to another. That is the God of Babel, described in a single phrase, by a man who was not trying to shock anyone. He was pointing at what is on the page. And his explanation wasn't that the biblical authors were fools. It was that they were writing for the people in front of them. The purpose of those books, he says, was never to make people learned. It was to make them obedient. So they described God in the only shape their audience could hold, a very large version of themselves. He made the point once as a joke, in a letter, and it became the most famous thing he ever wrote outside his books. In the autumn of 1674, a Dutch gentleman named Hugo Boxel wrote to Spinoza to argue that ghosts were real, because so many respectable people had seen them. In his reply, Spinoza wrote that if a triangle could speak, it would say that God is eminently triangular, and a circle would say the divine nature is eminently circular. Everyone, he wrote, gives God their own attributes, and finds everything else deformed. That is the flood God, not a revelation about the divine. A mirror. And what the mirror shows is the oldest human fantasy about power. That when the world disappoints you badly enough, you are entitled to wash it away and start over. So hold the picture honestly. A being who is surprised, who grieves, who regrets his own work, who has to come down and look. Does that sound like the ground of all reality? Or does it sound like the largest possible version of us? Spinoza was sure of the answer, but he had no way to prove it from outside the Bible. He had one book, one mind, and no evidence anyone else could hold in their hands. 200 years after he died, a man in London found that evidence, by accident, on his lunch break. In 1853, an excavator named Hormuzd Rassam was digging at Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, for the British Museum. He shipped back crates of broken clay tablets covered in cuneiform. They went into storage in London, and they sat there for roughly 20 years, because almost nobody on earth could read them. Now meet the man who could. George Smith was born in 1840, working class in London. At 14, he was apprenticed as a banknote engraver. Precise work, tiny lines, very good eyes. And somewhere along the way, he became obsessed with Assyria. He spent his lunch breaks at the British Museum, standing in front of the cases, teaching himself cuneiform. On his own. No university. No money. No teacher. He got good enough that the museum eventually hired him to sort and translate the tablets nobody else could handle. The engraver became the man they handed the boxes to. And in November 1872, in a second-floor room overlooking Russell Square, Smith picked up a fragment, cleaned it, and started reading a story. A flood, sent by the gods. A man warned in advance. A great boat. Animals brought on board. Birds released to look for land. The boat coming to rest on a mountain. A sacrifice after the water fell, and the gods gathering around the sweet smell of it. He was not reading Genesis. He was reading the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written down centuries before the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible. There is a famous story about what he did next. His colleague E. A. Wallace Budge wrote, decades afterwards, that Smith jumped up, ran around the room in a state of enormous excitement, and, in front of everyone present, began taking his clothes off. Take that one as you like. Budge was writing 50 years after the fact, and enjoyed a good story. What is not in dispute is what happened on the 3rd of December, 1872. Smith presented his translation to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and this was not a room of specialists. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was in the audience, William Gladstone, and so was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Sit with that image. The head of the British government and the head of the Church of England sat in a hall in London and listened to a self-taught banknote engraver read out a flood story with a boat and birds and a sacrifice at the end. That was older than the Bible. Within a week, the Daily Telegraph had run 3 articles on it. Then the newspaper made Smith an offer that tells you exactly what kind of moment this was. 1,000 guineas to fund an expedition to Nineveh and dig for the missing pieces, in exchange for exclusive rights to the story. He went, and in May 1873, on the 5th day of digging, he found a fragment he believed completed the flood account, which is a stroke of luck so improbable that people have been raising eyebrows at it ever since. He telegraphed London, the Telegraph printed it, and having got the story they had paid for, the sponsors closed the expedition down. Smith went back twice more anyway. In 1876, on the 3rd trip, he caught dysentery and died near Aleppo. He was 36, a lens grinder in The Hague, dead at 44, an engraver from London, dead at 36. Neither of them had a university post. Between them, they took the flood apart. Because here is what that tablet actually means. Before I tell you one thing, if you have made it this far, you already know this channel does not run on outrage. It runs on evidence. If that is what you want more of, subscribing is free, and it is the only reason videos like this reach anybody. And in the comments, I want to know something. Had you ever heard of George Smith before today? I suspect almost nobody was taught his name, and I would like to see whether I'm right. All right. The tablet. The flood story was not a private revelation handed to one people. It was a story the whole region told. Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hebrews. The same water, the same boat, the same birds, the same sacrifice at the end. And what changes from version to version is not the disaster, it is the gods. In the Mesopotamian version, the flood is sent because human beings have become too numerous and too loud, and the gods cannot sleep. That is the stated reason. Noise. In the Hebrew version, the reason is moral. Wickedness. Corruption. A world that had gone wrong. Same flood. Completely different motive. Each people painted its own gods onto the same water, and each one painted the motive it found most convincing, which is Spinoza's argument, in clay, 2 centuries after his death. He said the wrath was a human projection. Here are 2 different wraths, projected onto one flood. The water is the canvas, the wrath is the paint, and the hand holding the brush was always human. Now go back into the story itself and count what the water actually takes. The stated crime is human wickedness, the human heart, every inclination of it, evil from youth, every bird in every nest, every lamb in every field, every horse, every dog, every wild thing in every forest on earth, minus 1 breeding pair per kind, sealed in a boat. What was the wickedness of the sparrows? For what crime? Here's the kicker. And it does not stop at the animals. Run the inventory of the people. Every infant on the planet. Every toddler. Every child. Beings that the story's own moral logic cannot possibly call guilty. Drowned in the same water as the worst of the wicked. The flood does not distinguish. That is what a flood is. Water does not check hearts. It fills lungs. And this is the point, and it cuts deep. Justice, the exact thing this story claims to be, is defined by distinction. Justice weighs the individual, measures the deed, fits the response to the person who did it. The moment a punishment stops distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent, it is not justice anymore. It is just force. The flood, presented as the supreme act of divine justice, fails the most basic test justice has. And here is the strangest part of all. The Bible knows. A few chapters later, God announces that he will destroy Sodom. And Abraham stands in the road and argues with him. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And then he haggles. 50 righteous men. 45. 30. 20. 10. Read that scene next to the flood, and something uncomfortable happens. The argument against the flood is inside the Bible. It is in the mouth of the founder of the faith. And the whole scene only works if everyone involved already agrees on the premise that a God who destroys the innocent along with the guilty has failed as a judge. Scripture preserved the objection. It just arrives one story too late for the sparrows. Now look at who is standing on the other side of that comparison, because Noah is told the same thing. God tells him in advance that every living thing on the earth is about to die. And Noah says nothing. He does not ask why. He does not ask about the children. He does not bargain for 50 or for 10 or for 1. There is no scene. The text gives him no line at all. He builds, Abraham argued. Noah measured cubits. And then look at what the story does with him afterwards. The one righteous man on earth walks off that boat into a world where every person he ever knew is dead. And the first thing the text records him doing after the altar is planting a vineyard, making wine, and drinking until he passes out, after which the first family of the clean new world collapses into shame and cursing. Read as history. That is a very strange detail to include. Read as a story about human beings. It is the truest thing in the chapter. That is not a moral failure. That is a man who cannot live with what he watched. So come back to the sentence we started with, because after everything you have just seen, it lands differently. The flood had a stated purpose. It was a treatment. The world was sick, and the water was the cure. Wash the earth. Start clean. One good family. A fresh beginning. Did it work? The text answers immediately in God's own voice. The inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, after the flood. Unchanged. The same words that justified the drowning, now offered as the reason never to drown anyone again. And the story demonstrates it within a few verses. The righteous man is face down, drunk in his tent. Wickedness did not even wait a chapter. Read as a report of something that happened, this is incoherent. An all-knowing God performs a planetary amputation that he knew in advance would heal nothing. Read as what Spinoza taught us to see, a human story, about human fear, wearing a divine mask. It makes perfect sense. Because this is exactly how human rage works. Rage lashes out. Rage floods. And then, when the destruction is finished and the room has gone quiet, rage looks at what it did and understands that nothing underneath has changed. The promise after the flood is the morning after fury, written into the sky. And look at what he puts in that sky. The text does not call it a rainbow, it calls it a bow, a weapon. In the ancient imagination, the warrior hangs his war bow on the wall when the fighting is over. It is a beautiful image. But notice what kind of image it is. It is not the gesture of a judge who ruled correctly and stands by his verdict. It is the gesture of a fighter who went too far, knows it, and is promising the household it will not happen again. The people who told this story knew, somewhere in themselves, what stories like this are made of. So if the flood was not justice, and the wrath was ours, what was the story for? Who did it serve? Spinoza answered that too. And that is the part that got the book banned. Go back to the opening pages of the theological political treatise, where he starts with fear. He argues that the great secret of despotic government is to keep men deceived, and to dress up the fear that holds them down in the clothing of religion, so that people will fight for their own subjection as hard as they would fight for their freedom. That is a sentence from 1670, written by a man who was living in one of the freest republics in Europe and could see the machinery operating everywhere outside it. Now apply it to the rain, because notice what a disaster does when nobody understands its cause. It creates a vacancy. Somebody has to explain what happened, and whoever gets to say why the water came also gets to say what you must do, so that it doesn't come again. That is the whole business, and it is not a metaphor. If the flood was punishment for sin, then the flood was preventable, and the people who can tell you which sins caused it are the same people who can sell you the prevention. Sacrifice, tribute, confession, obedience. A random disaster generates nothing. A punishing disaster generates an industry. And this is why Spinoza's lawful, impersonal God was more dangerous than plain atheism. An atheist simply denies the throne and can be dismissed as a fool. Spinoza did something worse. He left God in place, infinite, real, permanent, and removed the anger. And a God with no anger cannot be appeased. And a God who cannot be appeased has nothing to sell. They understood exactly what he had done. The treatise was banned by the Dutch authorities in 1674. It went on to the Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books and stayed there. He had published it anonymously, with a false publisher and a false city printed on the title page, and it still followed him for the rest of his life. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been walking toward. If the anger was never in the water, what is actually in the water? Spinoza gave a specific answer, and it is the door out of the entire prison. Before we go through it, if this has been worth your time so far, a like costs you nothing. And it is what decides whether this video gets shown to anyone else at all. That is the entire ask. Now, his answer. Nature, Spinoza argued, acts from the necessity of its own laws. Always, everywhere, without exception. Rain falls because of pressure and temperature and moisture. Rivers rise by physics, not by verdict. The same laws that drown a valley in March will irrigate it in June. Nature does not check who is standing in it. And in chapter 6 of the treatise, he took apart the idea of miracles with a single observation. Nothing happens contrary to nature. A miracle is simply an event whose natural cause we have not worked out yet. But he did something far cleverer than just asserting that. He went into the text and found the causes still sitting there. Look at the plagues, he says. The locusts do not appear out of nothing. Exodus reports that an east wind blew for a full day and a night and brought them, and a west wind carried them away. Look at the sea. Exodus reports that the waters were driven back by a strong east wind that blew all night. The natural cause is right there on the page. Scripture records it, and then tells the story in the way that moves people, because, as Spinoza put it, its purpose was never to convince your reason. It was to take hold of your imagination. So now do the same thing to the flood. Genesis, chapter 8, verse 1. Before the water goes down, before the dove, before the mountain, before the altar, the text says that God made a wind pass over the earth, and the waters went down. A wind. Somebody 4,000 years ago wrote down the meteorology and then wrote a God on top of it. The cause and the story are sitting in the same paragraph. We have simply been reading only one of them. And history has run this experiment in public more than once. On the 1st of November, 1755, All Saints' Day, an earthquake destroyed Lisbon while the churches were full. The cathedrals came down on the people inside them. The candles lit for the feast set the ruins on fire, and a tsunami took the people who ran to the harbor to escape. Preachers across Europe called it a judgment. A judgment on whom? The wave took the devout at prayer, and the men drinking down at the port with exactly equal indifference. If that was a verdict, it was written by a judge who could not read. Nature does not aim. It has the way to aim. Aiming requires wanting something, and it doesn't want. And here is why any of this reaches you, 4,000 years later. Because you have felt the old reading, in your own chest. It is not just an ancient mistake. The diagnosis arrives. The job goes. The marriage ends. The water comes into the house. And a voice in you says, "What did I do to deserve this?" Be honest. When something terrible happens to you, what is the first question you ask? Not how did this happen? Why me? What did I do? That is the flood story, alive in you, right now. It is so deep in our bones that insurance contracts still call natural disasters acts of God. 4,000 years later, the water still has a signature on it. And that reflex does something cruel. It takes real suffering and lays a second suffering on top of it, the invented suffering of believing that the universe struck you on purpose, that somewhere there is a ledger, and your name is on it, and you earned this. Spinoza's answer to that voice is one of the most liberating sentences in the history of thought, and it is not complicated. Nothing struck you on purpose. There was no verdict. There is no judge in the weather. Things have causes. Causes are not accusations. And notice what you get in exchange for giving up the judge. When catastrophe is a verdict, you have exactly two options: guilt and appeasement. You did something. Now work out what, and pay for it. When catastrophe has causes, causes can be studied. Levees get built. Warnings get issued. Vaccines get found. The energy that used to go into what did we do to deserve this goes into how does this actually work, and how do we protect each other from it. Every dam, every forecast, every vaccine is the practical form of Spinoza's idea. You do not negotiate with a flood, you understand it. So when the next disaster comes, and it will come, and some voice, outside you or inside you, tells you that it is a judgment, remember the sentence at the end of the oldest disaster story we have. The confession is already in the book. The flood changed nothing, and the text says so, out loud, in God's own voice, in the last line. The wrath was never in the water. It was in the people standing on the shore, staring at it, needing it to mean something. The water was only ever water, and you were never on trial.